He shot the hostage anyway. Marco Marconi pressed the barrel against the kneeling man's temple, smiled at the security camera, and pulled the trigger. Not because the man had betrayed him, not because he had any information worth extracting, but because Damian Voss was watching the feed from across the city, and Marco wanted him to understand something fundamental. No one and nothing you love is safe from me. The man's name was Thomas Reeve. He was 53 years old. He drove Damian's father to his first meeting with the Chicago Council 22 years ago. He still carried a photograph of that day in his breast pocket when they found him. That is the kind of war this is. That is the kind of man Damian Voss is fighting. And somewhere across this frozen city, a woman who has nothing to do with any of it is about to walk into the center of it, carrying the one object that could end everything. If you were in her position, broke, scared, holding something you don't understand, what would you do? Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Every week we bring you stories like this one, raw, cinematic, and impossible to stop once you start. Drop a comment right now and tell us your city and country. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Hit that like button too. It genuinely helps more than you know. Now, let's get into it. Part 1. The Ring in the Alley. The temperature dropped to 11 degrees the night Elena Mercer found the ring, and she almost didn't stop. She almost kept walking, head down, scarf pulled over her nose. The cold so sharp it made her back teeth ache. She'd worked a 10-hour shift at the Field Museum processing a newly donated collection of Civil War-era correspondence, letters that smelled like old attics and other people's grief. And her feet hurt in the specific, unforgiving way that only comes from standing on concrete in shoes that gave up on her 6 months ago. She had $42 in checking. Her mother's next dialysis treatment was in 4 days. The insurance company had denied the latest claim that morning with a form letter so generic it didn't even have her mother's name spelled correctly. So no, she almost didn't stop. But the thing caught the light from a street lamp in a way that made her brain register it before her exhaustion could override the signal. A small flash, silver white against black ice. She slowed, and then she stopped, and she crouched down in the alley between West Erie and the parking structure, and she picked up the ring. It was heavier than it looked. Platinum, she realized immediately. Her archivist's hands knew metal density, the way a chef knows the feel of properly rested dough. Platinum and cold. So cold it burned against her palm, even through her glove. She pulled the glove off and held it under the yellow light. The band was wide, masculine, engraved on the outer face with a crest she didn't recognize. A raptor mid-dive, wings folded, talons first. Latin beneath it. Nullus timor, no fear, no gemstones, nothing flashy. But the craftsmanship was extraordinary, the kind of work that costs more than her car and her rent combined and still doesn't announce itself to strangers. She turned it over. On the inside of the band, scratched deep into the metal in a hand that looked like it was done quickly, deliberately, by someone who knew exactly what they were doing, a sequence of characters. Numbers and letters alternating, 8 groups separated by dashes. Her first thought was a serial number. Her second thought, looking more carefully at the pattern, was that it wasn't. She stood up. The alley was empty. Wind moved through it with the particular hollow sound that Chicago winter wind makes when it has nowhere else to go. There were marks in the snow she hadn't noticed when she crouched down. Heavy boot prints, multiple sets, chaotic, the kind of pattern that meant people had been running. Dark smears near the dumpster that she didn't examine closely. Her third thought was, put it back. Her fourth thought was her mother's face that morning, gray with fatigue, trying to smile from the hospital recliner while the machine cleaned her blood. She put the ring in her coat pocket. She couldn't sleep. This was not new. Elena Mercer had not slept well in 14 months, not since the diagnosis. Not since the first time she'd sat in a doctor's office and tried to do math in her head fast enough to keep pace with the numbers being spoken to her. The apartment she rented, a 1-bedroom in Logan Square that she'd taken because the landlord allowed month to month, had thin walls, and the couple 2 units over argued in cycles that peaked around 2 in the morning, and the radiator knocked and hissed like it was personally offended by the winter outside. She sat at her kitchen table with the ring in front of her and her laptop open and searched the image she'd photographed. Raptor, folded wings, Nullus timor, platinum signet. Nothing useful came back. Or rather, nothing useful in several things that were quietly alarming. Forums discussing Chicago organized crime, a 2-year-old Tribune piece about a grand jury investigation that went nowhere, a name that appeared 3 times in 3 separate contexts within the first page of results. Damian Voss. She read for 40 minutes. She read carefully, the way she'd been trained to read primary sources, looking for what wasn't said as much as what was, cross-referencing, noting where the language shifted from factual to careful. What she found was a portrait assembled from negative space. A man who had never been convicted of anything, never been photographed in a compromising context, never been directly linked in print to violence, and yet whose name appeared in the orbit of enough deaths, disappearances, and collapsed prosecutions that the absence of evidence had its own unmistakable shape. He was 32. He'd taken over his father's operation at 19 after Victor Voss was found in the river. He had an undergraduate degree from Northwestern that he'd finished in 2.5 years while simultaneously, according to 2 separate federal investigators quoted anonymously, consolidating control of the North Side with a precision that suggested either extraordinary intelligence or extraordinary ruthlessness, and possibly both. The Tribune had once described him as the Ice King of Chicago's underworld, a phrase that felt like it was trying to be poetic and landed somewhere close to accurate. Elena looked at the ring on her kitchen table. She thought about the boot prints in the snow, the dark smears near the dumpster. She thought, whoever lost this ring was either running from something or running toward it. Either way, they were moving fast enough to lose a piece of platinum jewelry that was not the kind of thing a person forgets they're wearing. She put the ring in her coat pocket again, closed the laptop, and did not sleep at all. In the morning, before she could talk herself out of it, she went to see Danny Park. Danny ran what he called an estate resale consultancy out of a narrow shop on Milwaukee Avenue that smelled like cigarettes and watchmaker's oil, and what he actually did was buy things people wanted converted to cash with a minimum of documentation. Elena had brought him 2 items in the past year, a pair of her grandmother's pearl earrings and a silver cigarette case that had belonged to her father. And he'd been fair both times, which in her current circumstances elevated him to the level of trusted contact. She put the ring on the glass counter between them. Danny looked at it without picking it up. She said, "Platinum. Clearly quality work. There's an inscription inside that looks like it could be, 'Where did you get this?'" It wasn't a question. His voice had dropped in a way that made her stop talking. "I found it," she said, "last night, in an alley off Erie." Danny still hadn't touched it. He was looking at the crest on the face of the ring the way a man looks at a live electrical wire. "Elena." "What?" "That crest." He pushed the ring back toward her with one finger, using the tip, the way you'd move something hot. "That's the Voss mark." She'd already known this, in the way you know something before you're ready to admit you know it. Hearing it said aloud was different. "Okay. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" "I think so." "I don't think you do." He leaned across the counter and lowered his voice, even though they were the only 2 people in the shop. 3 Marconi men are dead this morning. 2 more are missing. This happened last night, North Side, and the word on the street is, it was a hit. Marconi went after Voss directly, tried to take something from him. Danny looked at the ring. Tried and either failed or succeeded, depending on how you look at it. Elena felt the cold of the previous night in her bones all over again. "If Marconi's people see you with that," Danny said, "they'll assume you're running it for Voss. If Voss's people see you with it, they'll assume you took it from the scene for your own reasons." He straightened up. "There is no version of you holding that ring that ends well for you, Elena. None. So what do I do with it?" Danny was quiet for a long moment. I was 58 years old, and he had been operating in the margins of the Chicago underworld for 30 of those years, and he was still alive and still operating, which meant he'd developed a reliable instinct for the correct answer to questions exactly like this one. "Return it," he said, directly. "No middleman, no message, no delay. You walk up to the front door and you hand it to the first person you see, and you tell them exactly where you found it, and you ask for nothing." He paused. "And you pray to whatever you believe in that they're in a reasonable mood." She sat in her car for 20 minutes outside the address she'd found, an estate in Winnetka with a wall around it that struck her as something between architectural choice and military infrastructure. The gate was wrought iron. There were cameras on every visible surface. Two men in dark coats stood at the gate itself, and even from 30 yards she could see the particular way they held themselves, weight slightly forward, hands visible, watching everything. She thought about her mother. She thought, if something happens to me, there is no one to manage the next treatment. She thought, if I drive away and those Marconi people Danny mentioned find out I had this, something happens to me anyway. She got out of the car. The walk from her car to the gate was approximately 40 feet, and it was the longest 40 feet of her life. The cold wrapped around her throat. She kept her hands visible because it seemed like the kind of situation where keeping your hands visible was the correct decision. And the men at the gate watched her approach with the flat, measuring attention of people who had been trained to assess threat level as a continuous background process. She stopped 6 feet from the gate. "My name is Elena Mercer," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I found something last night that I think belongs to someone here. I'm not here to cause any trouble. I just want to return it and go home." The two men looked at each other. One of them, older, a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, spoke into an earpiece so briefly she almost missed it. They made her wait for 4 minutes. She counted. Then the gate opened. The inside of the estate looked nothing like she'd expected, which she'd later realize was exactly the point. She'd expected something that announced itself. Marble, gold fixtures, the aggressive decor of men who'd confused wealth with taste. What she found instead was restraint. Dark wood, understated furniture, original art on the walls that was genuinely good rather than merely expensive. A space designed by someone who understood the difference between power and the performance of power. She was shown into a room that appeared to function as a library. Two men flanked the door after she entered. A third stood to the left, watching her with the specific stillness of a person whose stillness is intentional. And then Damian Voss walked in. She recognized him from the photographs she'd found online, but the photographs had flattened something that was, in person, impossible to flatten. He was tall, taller than the images suggested, and moved with the measured economy of a man who had learned long ago that speed could be a liability and that people underestimated you when you didn't rush. He wore a charcoal suit, no tie, his collar open one button, dark hair. Dark eyes that swept the room when he entered and landed on her and stayed there. He looked at her for 4 full seconds without speaking. Elena had an instinct, developed over years of professional experience, for the internal state of a person studying an artifact of uncertain origin. You learn to recognize the particular quality of attention a person brings to something they need to authenticate before they can decide what it means. Damian Voss was looking at her the way she looked at a document she wasn't sure she could trust. "Elena Mercer," he said. Not a greeting, a confirmation. "Yes, you found the ring. In an alley off West Erie, around 11:30 last night." She reached into her coat pocket and held it out, flat on her palm. "I didn't take anything from it. I didn't copy the inscription or photograph it, or tell anyone what it said." A beat. "I told my friend Danny Park I had the ring because I went to ask him what to do with it. He told me to return it directly." She paused. "I'm telling you that because I'd rather you hear it from me first." Damian crossed the room in 8 steps and took the ring from her hand. He didn't look at it immediately. He was still watching her. "You went to a fence," he said. "I went to someone I trusted to give me honest advice. He did. Here I am." Something moved behind his eyes. Not warmth. She wouldn't have called it warmth. More like the slight recalibration of a person updating a calculation. He put the ring on, and then he said quietly to the man to his left, "She's not leaving yet." Elena felt the floor shift under her in a way that had nothing to do with physics. "I beg your pardon?" "Someone took a photograph." He turned to face her fully for the first time, and his expression was not cruel, which was almost worse because cruelty she understood. This was something colder. "Last night, during the ambush, one of the Marconi surveillance crews captured you in the alley. They have you picking up the ring. They don't know who you are yet." A pause. "But they will. And when they find you before I do, they will assume you're my informant or my courier or my leverage because in their world there is no such thing as innocent coincidence." Elena said slowly, "So you're telling me I'm in danger?" "I'm telling you that you were in danger approximately 8 hours ago and didn't know it." He looked at her with that unreadable precision. I'm also telling you that the safest place you can be right now is in this house, under my protection, until I resolve the Marconi situation. How long will that take? I don't know.
That's not an answer. No, he said, and there was something in his voice that might have been, in another life, in another man, the very early edge of respect. It isn't.
She stood in the center of that room with its restrained furniture and its original art and its two silent men at the door, and she thought about $42 in checking and her mother's dialysis and the dark smears in the snow near the dumpster on West Erie, and she thought about Danny Park's face when he'd recognized the crest. She said, I need to make a phone call. My mother has a medical appointment. Damian Voss studied her for one more second. Then he said, Of course, and nodded to the man on the left. Outside the tall windows, Chicago pressed against the glass in its gray winter patience, and the war that Elena Mercer had accidentally walked into was already 3 moves ahead of everyone who thought they understood it, including the man standing 6 feet away from her, turning his recovered ring slowly on his finger with the habitual gesture of someone reminding himself what he's fighting to protect. He would not understand until much later that the ring was already the second most valuable thing that had entered this house in the last 5 minutes. The phone call to her mother lasted 6 minutes and cost Elena more than she'd expected. Not financially. She'd already burned past the point where money was the primary currency of her anxiety. What it cost her was the particular kind of composure she'd been maintaining since she walked through that gate, the careful, deliberate steadiness she'd assembled like scaffolding around herself because she understood, on some functional level, that the moment she stopped performing calm was the moment the men in this house would stop treating her like a guest and start treating her like a problem. Her mother picked up on the second ring with the eager speed of a woman who had been waiting by the phone, which was its own quiet devastation. Ellie, you didn't text this morning. I know, Mom. I'm sorry. Something came up at work. The lie arrived without friction, which told her something about herself she didn't particularly want to examine. Your appointment Thursday is still on. I confirmed it. You sound strange. I'm tired. Long night. A pause. Her mother had always been able to read her through the phone with an accuracy that defied explanation. Some frequency of voice, some texture of breath that transmitted information, her words didn't. Are you safe? Elena stood at the window of the room they'd put her in, a guest suite on the second floor, furnished with the same restrained precision as the rest of the house. Nothing ostentatious, nothing warm, and looked out at the grounds below where 2 of Damian's men were making a slow perimeter walk through the snow. Their breath rose in small white clouds. Their hands were at their sides. I'm safe, she said. I'll call you tonight. She hung up and sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself exactly 90 seconds of something she could only call controlled disintegration, the kind of feeling that doesn't have a precise name, that sits between terror and exhaustion and the strange, almost chemical relief of having made a decision you can't unmake. Then she stood up, straightened her coat, and went to find out exactly what kind of situation she'd walked into. The man who came to get her was named Rourke. He didn't volunteer this information. She extracted it by the simple method of asking his name directly, which seemed to briefly disrupt his professional composure in a way that satisfied her more than it should have. He was mid-40s, built like someone who had been large once and had compressed it into something denser and more efficient over the years. And he moved through the hallways of the estate with the proprietary ease of a man who had spent enough time in a place to stop noticing it. He brought her to a smaller room off the main corridor. Not the library where she'd met Damian, but something that functioned as a secondary office, utilitarian, a large table with secure monitors on one end and a coffee station that had been used recently enough that the smell still hung in the air. Damian was at the table with 2 other men she hadn't seen before. The conversation they'd been having stopped the moment she walked in. In that specific way conversations stop, when the topic is the person who just entered. One of the 2 men, younger, maybe late 20s, with the kind of restless energy that expressed itself as constant minor movement, a pen turning in his fingers, weight shifting, looked at her with open assessment. The other, older, heavy-set, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, looked at her with something closer to suspicion, wearing the costume of neutrality. Damian said, "Sit down." She sat. "This is Marcus," he said, meaning the restless younger one. "And Holt." the older one. They run operations. They're going to ask you some questions about last night, and I need you to answer them the same way you answered me, completely, and without editing yourself for what you think we want to hear.
Okay, Elena said.
Marcus leaned forward immediately. What time exactly did you enter the alley? 11:22. I checked my phone when I turned off Erie because I was calculating how long the L would take. You took the L? I drove. My car was in the parking structure that the alley runs behind. Which entrance? West side, ground level. You see anyone when you entered? No. Hear anything? She thought about this carefully because she'd been thinking about it since she woke up, and she wanted to be accurate. A car accelerating, somewhere on Erie, moving north. I registered it as noise and moved past it. At the time, I wasn't looking for anything. Marcus wrote something. The ring was where? Center of the alley, approximately 40 feet from the Erie end. It was catching light from the parking structure lamp. That's the only reason I saw it. You said you noticed marks in the snow, Damian said. He'd been watching her since she sat down, and his attention had a particular weight to it. Not hostile, but complete, the way a person pays attention when they've decided they need all available information before they can form a position. Boot prints. Multiple sets. And yes, dark marks near the dumpster on the north wall. I didn't examine them closely. Holt spoke for the first time. His voice was flat and deliberate. Why not? Because I'm an archivist, not an investigator. And at 11:22 at night in a Chicago alley in January, I was more focused on getting to my car. Holt said, But you took the ring. Yes. Why? The question sat in the room with more weight than its two letters seemed to warrant. Elena understood what was actually being asked. Not for a narrative explanation, but for a motivational one. They wanted to understand her decision-making because her decision-making was the variable they couldn't yet model. My mother is on dialysis, she said. I have $42 in my checking account. I found an item of obvious value in an empty alley with no identification markers and no obvious owner. I took it because I needed it, and I thought I could. She paused. And then I found out whose it was, and I brought it back because I'm not an idiot. Something shifted in the room. Not dramatically. Nothing in that room happened dramatically. She was already learning that. But a small recalibration, like a barometric change you feel in your ears before you understand what it means. Marcus looked at Damian. Damian's expression didn't change. Holt said, The Marconi surveillance image. How do we know you weren't placed there? I wasn't. How do we know that? Because if I'd been placed there by the Marconi family, I would not have walked through your gate this morning and handed you back the object they'd presumably sent me to acquire. A pause. Unless, Holt said, you handed back the ring because you'd already copied what was inside it and the ring itself was no longer useful to you. Elena looked at him steadily. I told Mr. Voss I didn't photograph the inscription. That was the truth. People tell Mr. Voss lots of things that turn out not to be the truth. I'm sure they do. I'm not those people. You understand why I can't simply take your word for that. I understand it perfectly. I don't have to like it. Holt looked at her for another 4 seconds, then looked at Damian, and the look was not entirely disapproving. Damian said, That's enough for now. And Marcus and Holt gathered their things with the practiced efficiency of men who had been dismissed many times and had learned to make it look voluntary. When they were gone, the room was very quiet. Damian poured 2 cups of coffee from the station on the table without asking if she wanted one and slid one across to her. She took it because she hadn't slept, and because refusing felt like a different kind of vulnerability than accepting. Holt will run your background check in the next 2 hours, he said. Everything you've told me will be verified. Good, Elena said. It'll all hold up. I know. She looked up from the coffee. The way you answered those questions, he said, and stopped, as if deciding how much of his reasoning to make visible. The way you answered them was not the way a person answers who is performing honesty. It was the way a person answers who is tired and annoyed and telling the truth because it's the path of least resistance. He drank his coffee. Those are different things. I can usually tell the difference. Usually, she said. Usually, he agreed, and there was something in his voice that might have been acknowledgement, not of her specifically, but of the concept of uncertainty, which she gathered was not a thing he admitted to often. The argument she wasn't supposed to hear happened at 4 in the afternoon. She'd been given access to the library and had spent 2 hours with a book she couldn't concentrate on, listening to the house move around her. The low frequency of men going about purposeful business, phones, footsteps, one raised voice on the floor above her that lasted 3 minutes and then went silent. The estate had the particular atmosphere of a place that operated on a permanent war footing, where everything was functional and nothing was casual, and where the absence of visible weapons was its own kind of statement. She was near the door of the library when Marcus and another man she hadn't met came down the hallway outside, and either they didn't know she was there or they didn't care, because the conversation was unguarded in a way that told her everything she needed to know about the fracture lines running through this organization. "He's keeping her here," the other man said. He had a South Side accent and a voice like gravel settling. "That's a mistake." "Not our call," Marcus said, but the way he said it suggested it was a position he'd arrived at through argument rather than conviction. "It becomes our call when she's a liability. Marconi already has the image. Every hour she's here is an hour they can use to build a story about her, about us harboring a witness, about she's not a witness. She's a loose thread. In this game, loose threads get people killed." The gravel voice dropped lower. "Victor never would have brought a civilian inside the house." A silence. Then Marcus said very quietly, "Victor's dead." Another silence, longer, with a different texture. "Yeah," the other man said. "He is." Footsteps. They moved away down the corridor and the library settled back into its held-breath quiet, and Elena stood very still with her book and her cold coffee, and the understanding that the debate about her fate was ongoing, and that at least one voice in it found her continued presence to be an active threat. She set the book down and went to find Damian. She found Rourke instead, who told her Damian was unavailable, and she said, "Tell him I need 5 minutes," with enough authority that Rourke relayed the message rather than simply refusing, which she counted as a small victory in a day that was running short on them. Damian came out of a room at the end of the corridor with the particular expression of a man who had agreed to an interruption and was already calculating how long it would take. When he saw her face, the calculation shifted. "What happened?" he said. "I overheard a conversation I wasn't meant to hear." She told him what she'd heard, without embellishment, the same way she'd answered Marcus's questions that morning. When she finished, Damian's expression had not changed in any way she could catalog, but the air around him had. "Which direction did they go?" "Toward the east wing." He said something under his breath that she didn't catch. Then he looked at her and said, "The man with Marcus. Describe him." She did. Medium height, early 40s, close-cropped hair going silver at the temples, a vertical scar on the right side of his jaw. Damian listened and went very still in a way that was distinct from his ordinary stillness, which was already considerable. "That's Carver," he said. "Who's Carver?" "A beat. The kind of beat that happens when someone is deciding how much information is appropriate to share with a person they don't yet fully trust." "He runs the South Side operation," Damian said. "He was my father's man before he was mine." Another pause. "And he's been arguing for 2 months that the Marconi situation requires a response I've been unwilling to authorize." Elena let the implications settle. "He wants escalation. He wants a war." Damian looked down the corridor in the direction she'd indicated, and his jaw was set in a way that she could now read, after one day, as controlled anger. "He thinks restraint is weakness. He's been building a case for it since October. And now he has me to point to," Elena said. "A civilian inside your house. A variable you introduced that he didn't sanction. A reason to say your judgment is compromised." Damian turned back to her and looked at her with that complete measuring attention. "Yes," he said. "That's a problem. Yes. For both of us," she said, "but more immediately for me. Nothing will happen to you in this house." "I appreciate that. I'm less certain Carver shares your position." Something crossed his face then. Not quite emotion, but the seismic suggestion of it, the surface vibration that indicates larger movement below. He said, "I'll handle Carver." And the words were so flat and certain that she believed them, which was itself something to examine later, in private. The fact that she had begun to believe this man's statements not because she had evidence for them, but because of the specific quality of his certainty. "Okay," she said. She turned to go back to the library. "Elena?" She stopped. "The inscription in the ring," he said. She turned back. He was looking at her with something she couldn't immediately name. You said you didn't photograph it. You said you didn't copy it. But you looked at it for long enough to tell Danny Park you'd found the ring, which means you looked at it for long enough to notice it was significant. He paused. What did you make of it? She considered the question carefully. 8 groups, she said, numbers and letters alternating within each group, but not randomly. There's an internal logic to the sequencing. The separating dashes are consistent in length. It's not a serial number and it's not a date code. She met his eyes. It's an encryption key, or part of one. The silence that followed was very long. You got all that, he said, from looking at a ring in a street lamp in an alley at 11:30 at night. I'm an archivist, she said. Reading things quickly and accurately is my entire professional skill set. He looked at her for another moment, and this time she could not read his expression at all, which she was beginning to understand was rarer than it seemed. Most people, if you paid attention, leaked their interior state through some channel or another. Damian Voss had evidently spent years sealing every one of his. Get some rest, he said. Tomorrow is going to be harder. The first sign that tomorrow had arrived early came at 2:47 in the morning when the alarm in the East Wing went off. Not a fire alarm, a security breach notification. She learned this later, but she understood it in the moment from the quality of the sound and the immediate response it generated, controlled, rapid movement through the corridors, voices and clipped communication, the heavy thud of a door being opened under pressure at some distance from her room. She was already sitting up when Rourke knocked. He opened the door without waiting. Stay here, he said. Don't open this door for anyone who doesn't have my face. What happened? Stay here, he said again, and closed it. She sat in the dark and listened to the house rearrange itself around a crisis she couldn't see, and she thought about Carver's voice in the corridor, loose thread, and she thought about what it meant that someone had breached the East Wing at 3 in the morning, and none of the conclusions she arrived at were comfortable. It took 40 minutes for the house to settle back into something approaching stillness. When Damian came to her door, he looked like a man who had not slept and had no intention of sleeping and had made peace with this fact some time ago. His jacket was gone. The collar of his shirt was open further than it had been. There was a tension in the line of his shoulders that his suit had been concealing. He said, someone accessed the secondary server room, East Wing, lower level. Elena waited. They copied a directory. Encrypted, but the fact of the directory itself is information. He leaned against the door frame with his arms crossed and looked at her with the kind of exhausted directness that only emerges at 3 in the morning when the social machinery has been running too long to maintain itself. The server room requires a 6-digit access code that only 4 people in this house know. How many people are in this house? 19. And 4 of them know that code. Yes. She absorbed this. You think it was Carver? I don't know yet. He said it the way a person says something they've been trying not to say. I can't know yet, which is its own problem. Because if you move on him without proof, you split your own organization. The look he gave her was brief but sharp. You're not surprised I worked that out, she said. I'm adjusting my expectations, he said, and it landed somewhere between admission and warning. She said, what does the directory contain? Names, he said. Financial routing, the structural architecture of the legitimate businesses I've been building for the past 3 years. Everything I've done to move this organization towards something that doesn't end with all of us in federal custody or in the ground. He paused. It's the future. Everything I've built toward my father's promise. His voice stayed level, but something beneath it did not. If Marconi gets that information, they don't need to fight us. They can simply hand it to the FBI and watch from a safe distance. Elena sat on the edge of the bed and thought about the ring and the inscription and the particular density of the information this man was carrying, and she thought about Victor Voss found in the river, and she thought about the photograph Marconi had of her in the alley, and she said, so the ring was a decoy. Damian looked at her. The ambush last night, she said. They took the ring because they wanted you focused on recovering it. While your people were mobilizing around the ring, something else was happening, or being set up to happen. She looked at him carefully. Someone on the inside knew the ring would draw your attention completely. Someone on the inside told them to go for it. The room was very quiet. That's why the server room breach was tonight, she said. Not random. They needed the chaos of the ambush and the recovery to establish a pattern of movement in this house, learn the response protocols, identify the window. She paused. They've been inside this organization longer than the ambush. This was planned in pieces, over time, by someone who knows how you think. Damian Voss stood in her doorway at 3 in the morning and looked at her with an expression she couldn't name then, but would think about later. Something that existed in the space between recognition and the specific loneliness of a man who had been surrounded by people for years and had not, until this moment, been genuinely surprised by another person's mind. He said very quietly, "How long have you been running that analysis?" "Since about 2 this afternoon," she said. "When I realized that the thing you were most focused on protecting, the ring, the encryption key, your father's legacy, was exactly the thing that was being used as a distraction from what someone actually wanted." He was silent for a long time. Then he said, "I need you to tell me everything you've worked out, all of it, from the beginning." "Now?" "Now." She looked at him. The open collar, the absent jacket, the weight of a man carrying something heavy enough to have changed the shape of how he held himself. And she said, "Then I'm going to need more coffee." And he almost smiled, which was the first time she'd seen anything close to it, and it changed his face in a way that was harder to dismiss than she would have preferred. She stood up. She walked to the door. And as she passed him into the corridor, the house settling around them in its 3 in the morning quiet, she understood with a clarity that had nothing to do with analysis and everything to do with the simple animal fact of standing 6 inches from another human being who was choosing, for the first time she'd witnessed, to trust someone. She understood that whatever door had been standing between her and this situation had just closed behind her, and the sound it made was final, and she was not, and this was the part that surprised her most, entirely sorry about it. The coffee was bad. Not terrible. Someone in this house knew how to operate a machine, but it had been sitting in the carafe for long enough that it had developed the particular bitterness of coffee that's been kept warm past the point of dignity, and Elena drank it anyway, standing at the table in the secondary office at 4 in the morning, while Damian sat across from her with a legal pad and a pen and the expression of a man who had decided to listen before he decided what to think. She laid it out the way she would have presented a contested provenance case at the museum, chronologically, with the evidence mapped against the timeline, the gaps acknowledged rather than papered over. She told him what she'd noticed about the ambush. The ring lost in an alley rather than taken, which meant whoever orchestrated the attack had not been primarily interested in acquiring it, but in ensuring that its recovery would consume Damian's attention and his resources for a defined window of time. She told him about the boot prints, multiple sets, the chaotic pattern of people moving in response to something rather than toward something, suggesting the ambush site had been relocated at the last moment, or that the attackers had expected a different response than they got. She told him about the server room timing. The breach happened not during the chaos of the ambush itself, but the night after, when the house had settled into what it believed was a resolved crisis, and the security posture had relaxed by exactly the small margin that always opens up after a threat appears to have passed. Damian wrote and asked no questions while she talked, which was the behavior of someone storing information rather than reacting to it, and she found she respected the discipline of it. When she finished, he set the pen down. "The access code," he said, "for the server room. 4 people. "Yes." "Myself. Holt. Marcus." He paused on the third name the way a person pauses on a step they're not sure will hold their weight. "And Carver." The name sat between them. "You can't move on him without proof," she said. "You told me that. Splitting the organization gives Marconi everything they need without firing another shot. I know what I told you. So what does proof look like in your world?" He looked at her, and she could see him running calculations behind his eyes. Not about her, not anymore, but about the geometry of his own situation, the angles of it, the places where the lines of loyalty and interest in history converged or failed to. "It looks like catching him in the act," he said, "or finding the communication chain, something physical, something that doesn't require me to take my own word for it in front of men who've known Carver for 15 years. "How long have you known him?" "Since I was 9. The answer came without hesitation, which told her it wasn't a fact he ever forgot. "He drove me to school the morning after my father's funeral. He didn't say anything the entire drive. He just drove. And then he stopped in front of the building and he looked at me and he said, "You're Victor's son. That means something in this city. Don't let them forget it." Damian's jaw tightened by a degree. I was 9 years old, and I believed him. Elena was quiet for a moment. "And now you're not 9. "No." "Do you still believe him?" He picked up the pen again and turned it in his fingers once, twice, and set it back down. "I believe that people are capable of holding two true things simultaneously. That Carver meant every word he said to me that morning." A pause. "And that 23 years later, the organization looks different to him than it looked then. And what he thinks it should be, and what I'm making it into are not the same thing. And loyalty," Elena said carefully, "in your world, has limits." "In every world," Damian said, "loyalty has limits. The difference in mine is that when it breaks, it doesn't break quietly." Holt's background check on her came back clean at 7 in the morning, delivered in the form of Holt himself, appearing in the doorway of the office where she and Damian had been working through the implications of what she'd mapped out, and setting a single printed page on the table between them with the wordless economy of a man who had been in this business long enough to let documents speak. She read her own life in summary form: 31 years old, no criminal record, master's degree in archival studies from the University of Illinois, employed at the Field Museum for 4 years, one outstanding medical debt collection matter, no known affiliations with organized crime or law enforcement. The phrase "no known affiliations" sat oddly. She'd never before been a person whose affiliations required investigation. Damian didn't read it. He'd been looking at the window. Holt said, "We also pulled the Marconi surveillance image, the ones they have of her." He put a second page on the table. Elena looked at it and felt something cold move through her chest. It was grainy, time-stamped, clearly extracted from a fixed camera on the north face of the parking structure. It showed her clearly: her coat, her scarf, the particular angle of her crouch as she picked up the ring. Her face was visible. Not perfectly. The resolution dropped at the edges, but recognizably hers to anyone who already knew what they were looking for. "They identified her," Holt said. The cold deepened. "When?" Damian said. "Sometime in the last 6 hours. We intercepted a communication, encrypted, but our people cracked the format." Holt set a third page down. "They know her name, her address, her mother's dialysis schedule." Elena's hands went flat on the table. The dialysis schedule. Someone had accessed her mother's medical appointments. Not her name, not her address. Those were obtainable through public records with patients. But the specific clinical scheduling of her mother's treatment, which existed in a medical system database behind privacy protections, accessible to a person with either extraordinary technical capability or a contact inside the healthcare system. "How do they have that?" she said. Her voice came out very level, which surprised her. Holt didn't answer, which was its own answer. Damian said, "It tells us 2 things. They've had significant lead time preparing this operation. This isn't reactive intelligence gathering. This is a profile they built in advance. And they're going to use her," Elena said. Both men looked at her. "My mother," she said. "They're not going to come after me directly, because coming after me means engaging with you, and that's a resource expenditure they don't need to make. They're going to use my mother's schedule to get to me. Make me come to them. Make me do something that separates me from this house." She looked at Damian, which means the question isn't whether they'll make a move toward her. It's when. Damian said, "Rourke," and Rourke materialized in the doorway with the immediacy of a man who had been positioned there in anticipation of exactly this kind of moment. "Take 4 people to the Mercy Medical Dialysis Unit. As of right now, her mother's appointments happen with our people in the building." Rourke nodded and was gone. Elena let out a breath she'd been holding since she read the word schedule on that page. The release of it made her realize how much of her energy she'd been consuming simply by holding herself together, and she made a conscious decision to recognize that and set it aside because there was no room for it yet. "Thank you," she said. Damian didn't respond to the thanks, which she was beginning to understand was not coldness, but something more like discomfort with gratitude directed at him specifically, as though he'd received it rarely enough that he didn't have a practiced way to absorb it. "I need you to stay in the East Wing today," he said. "Top floor. It's the most defensible position in the house, and I need to know where you are while I deal with something." "Carver." I need to give him a reason to move. He stood, and in standing reclaimed something she'd seen him shed in the last few hours without noticing. The particular authority of a man who had built his life on never letting anyone see him think. I'm going to tell him the server room breach was unsuccessful, that the directory was behind a secondary encryption he didn't know about, that we have a 24-hour window before Marconi realizes they have incomplete information. You're going to watch him, Elena said. See who he contacts. Within 4 hours, Damian said, he will either contact Marconi to report the failure, or he'll contact someone inside this house to plan a second attempt. He looked at her. Either way, I'll have what I need. And if he doesn't contact anyone, if he's not the one? The question landed quietly. Then I'm wrong, Damian said, and I've lost 4 hours and nothing else. He said it with the practiced neutrality of a man accustomed to being right, and Elena heard in it, underneath the control, the very faint register of a man who was aware that being wrong about Carver would mean something more personal than a tactical miscalculation, and that the personal dimension was the part he was least equipped to handle. So, the 4 hours became 2. She was in the top-floor sitting room of the East Wing, watching the grounds below where the winter light fell thin and gray across unbroken snow, when Marcus appeared in the doorway with a face that had lost its characteristic restless energy and replaced it with something flat and urgent. Damian needs you downstairs, he said. What happened? Come downstairs. The room he brought her to was not the office and not the library, but a third space she hadn't been in before, smaller, more functional, the kind of room that revealed its purpose through what was in it, a monitor displaying a frozen frame of security footage, a recording device, Holt with his reading glasses down from his forehead for the first time and actually on his nose, and Damian standing at the center of the room with his back to the door when she entered and not turning around immediately. When he did turn around, she understood immediately that what she was looking at was not controlled anger. What she was looking at was a man who had absorbed a shock large enough to have cracked the architecture of his composure and was holding the pieces together through the specific learned discipline of a person who has trained himself never to let the break show in public. Look at the monitor, he said. She looked. The frozen footage showed a parking garage, not the one behind the alley where she'd found the ring, a different one, newer, fluorescent lit. 2 figures. The quality was good enough to be damning. One of them was Carver. The other was a woman she didn't recognize. Mid-40s, dark coat, her face turned 3/4 toward the camera in a way that suggested she didn't know the camera was there, or didn't care. She was handing Carver a document. Carver was handing her something small. A drive, Elena thought. The size and shape were right. And the body language between them was not the body language of strangers conducting a transaction. It was the body language of people who had done this before. When was this? Elena said. 46 days ago, Holt said. She turned to look at him. 46 days. The camera's in a structure we own on the west side. It records to a server that backs up automatically. We don't review the footage unless there's a reason to flag it. He took his glasses off. We flagged it this morning. Who's the woman? Christine Voss, Damian said. The name registered slowly, then all at once. You're my father's sister, he said. My aunt. He said it the way a person says the name of a disease they've just been diagnosed with. Not with emotion exactly, but with the specific weight of a word that has irrevocably changed the map of the future. She left Chicago 6 years ago, after my father died. I transferred her a significant settlement because she was family and because she asked for nothing, and I thought that meant she wanted nothing. He stopped. I was wrong about that. The silence in the room had a quality Elena had never encountered before. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of too much information arriving faster than anyone could process it. The kind of silence that forms in the space between understanding what you've seen and understanding what it means. She's been working with Marconi for how long? Elena said. We don't know yet, Marcus said. We're running the footage backward, checking every facility camera we have access to, looking for prior contact. But the drive Carver handed her. He stopped and looked at Damian, a look that asked permission, and Damian gave it with a slight nod. It matches the file architecture of the server room directory, the one breached last night. So Carver got it out, Elena said, and she's the conduit to Marconi. She is Marconi, Damian said, and the 3 words carried a weight that compressed the air in the room. Christine has been their liaison for the North Side operations for at least 2 years. We traced the communication chain back 6 months. She was in the room, not physically, through intermediaries, when they planned the ambush. He looked at the frozen frame on the monitor. She told them about the ring. She told them what it contained. She told them when to hit the convoy. The ambush that had started everything. The ring in the alley, Elena in the alley. She felt the structure of the preceding 48 hours rearrange itself around this new central fact, every event recontextualizing. The ambush. Not a Marconi initiative, but a family initiative. The server breach, not opportunism, but the execution of a plan designed by someone who knew the internal architecture of the Voss operation from the inside because she'd grown up inside it, because she was blood. She knew about the encryption key, Elena said. She helped my father design the security protocol for the fortune, Damian said quietly. She was the only person outside my father and myself who knew the ring existed. So she knew that recovering the ring would consume me entirely. Yes. Elena turned to him. And Carver? Damian moved to the monitor and touched the edge of the frame, Carver's image, specifically, with one finger, and then dropped his hand. Carver has been trying to turn this organization into something my father would have recognized, something built on fear and violence, and the kind of power that has to keep proving itself to exist. He pulled his hand back. Christine offered him that. She told him that if Marconi dismantled my operation, they would hand the North Side back to him to run as he saw fit. A pause. She sold him a kingdom. She just didn't mention it would be built on the ruins of everything I've spent 3 years building. Does he know she's Marconi's liaison? No, Holt said. As far as we can tell, he thinks he's dealing with a disaffected family member. He thinks he's being offered a restoration. Holt's voice was professionally flat, but there was something underneath it that wasn't. He doesn't know he's the instrument. The word landed in the room like a stone into still water. Elena said, "Where is she now?" "That's the problem," Marcus said, and the restless energy was back, transformed into something clenched and purposeful. "She's here." The cold that moved through Elena this time was different from the one she'd felt reading about her mother's dialysis schedule. That cold had been fear. This one was something more primitive, the specific animal awareness of a threat that is not in the distance but in the room, or the next room, or closer. "In the house," she said. "She arrived this morning," Holt said, "at 6:42, before we had the footage flagged, before we ran the camera backward, before we knew." He looked at Damian with an expression that was as close to apology as she'd seen from him. "She said she'd heard about the ambush, and she was worried. She asked to stay." "And you let her in," Elena said. "She's family," Damian said, and the word had a different sound in his mouth now than it had 5 minutes ago. Older. Corroded. Like a coin that's been in salt water long enough that you can see its shape, but can no longer read what it says. "She doesn't know you have the footage," Elena said. "Not yet." "And Carver?" "In the East Wing. I gave him the cover story about the failed breach 2 hours ago. He believed it, or appeared to." Damian looked at her, and what she saw in his face now was the thing she'd only glimpsed edges of before. The exhaustion. The specific weight of a man who had been right about the wrong things and wrong about the things that mattered, and who was in the process of absorbing that gap. If Carver and Christine are coordinating directly inside this house, with Marconi in contact externally, they don't need another breach, Elena said. They're already inside. Yes, she thought rapidly. So you can't move on Carver without alerting Christine. And you can't confront Christine without Carver knowing something has shifted. And you can't let either of them know what you know, because the moment they realize the footage exists, they'll trigger whatever contingency Marconi has in place. She looked at Damian. "What's the contingency?" "I don't know yet." "You need to find out before you move." "I know." "Which means you need someone they won't be watching." She heard what she was saying a half-second before she finished saying it, and the part of her that was still the woman from the museum with $42 in checking wanted to stop there, to leave the sentence incomplete, to not volunteer for what the logic was pointing toward. But the part of her that had been running analysis for 2 days and had stopped sleeping and had watched a man absorb the information that the person he trusted most in the world had been dismantling him from the inside. That part kept going. "Which means you need me." The room was quiet. "No," Damian said. "Think about it." "I have." She doesn't know who I am. She knows there's a civilian in the house. Carver will have told her that much. But she doesn't know what I know or what I've worked out. To her, I'm a loose end your judgment created. I'm evidence that you're compromised. Elena kept her voice level and her eyes on his. So let me be that. Let me be exactly what she thinks I am. Let me talk to her. She will identify the threat within 30 seconds of speaking to you. Not if I'm not threatening, Elena said. I'm good at reading things. I'm also good at being read incorrectly. She paused. I spent 4 years in a museum working with donors who were trying to pass off forgeries as genuine acquisitions, and none of them ever knew I made them. I know how to seem like what I'm not. Marcus made a sound that might have been the beginning of agreement. Holt said nothing, but he had stopped looking at Damian and started looking at Elena, which was its own form of commentary. Damian stood with his arms crossed and looked at her for a long time. He said, if she identifies you, she will not do anything visibly. She will relay a signal to Marconi, and within an hour of that signal, we will have a problem outside these walls that dwarfs everything we've managed so far. I understand. You understand intellectually. I'm asking if you understand physically, in the way your body understands a thing when it's real. She held his eyes. I understand.
Another long silence. You'll wear an earpiece, he said finally. Holt will be 20 feet away at all times. You keep the conversation to 5 minutes and you find out one thing, whether she knows about the footage. How do I find that out without asking? If she knows, Damian said, she'll be trying to manage you. The conversation will have a direction she's steering it toward. You'll feel it. He looked at her with an expression that contained in its precision something that was not entirely tactical. You're good at reading things. Read her. Christine Voss was not what Elena had expected, and she spent 3 seconds recalibrating before the conversation began. She'd expected someone performing, playing the concerned relative, wearing grief like a costume, the kind of person whose falseness you could feel in the room before they spoke. What she found instead was a woman who appeared entirely comfortable in her own skin, which was far more dangerous. Mid-50s, elegant without trying to be, with dark eyes that took inventory of Elena in the first second of eye contact and filed the results with efficient precision. You must be Elena, Christine said. She was sitting in the smaller parlor off the main corridor, a cup of tea in front of her that she hadn't touched. Damian mentioned you, did he? He said you found Victor's ring. She smiled, and the smile was warm, and that was the most alarming thing about her. That must have been frightening, walking into all of this. It was surprising, Elena said, and sat across from her and folded her hands on her knees and began to read. The hands, perfectly still, too still. Not the stillness of relaxation, but the stillness of controlled vigilance, the specific physical discipline of a person maintaining a performance so familiar it had become second nature. The eyes. Warm on the surface, but with a timing issue. The warmth arrived a fraction of a second after it should have, which meant it was generated rather than spontaneous. The tea, untouched, a prop. He's lucky you were honest, Christine said. Most people in your position wouldn't have been. I didn't think I had much choice. You always have a choice. Christine tilted her head slightly. That's something Victor used to say. Every decision is a choice, even the ones that feel inevitable. He sounds like he was a remarkable man. He was. The warmth shifted for just a moment, something genuine cracking through, which was interesting because it meant she'd actually loved Victor. The betrayal of his son was therefore not a betrayal of the father. In her internal architecture, she'd built a story that separated them, that made dismantling Damian's work somehow consistent with honoring Victor's memory. Damian is very like him in some ways, less patient, more... She paused, searching for the word with a deliberateness that was itself a choice. More certain. That seems like a good quality, Elena said, given what he does. Does it? Christine's eyes were very direct. Certainty can be a vulnerability. It makes you predictable. A small pause. Don't you think? There it was. The conversation had a direction, and she felt it now, the slight pressure of being steered, not toward anything overt, but away from something. Away from the question of the house's security, away from the server room, away from anything that would require Elena to demonstrate specific knowledge. She was being assessed, and the assessment had a timer on it. I don't know enough about his world to have an opinion,
Elena said, which was a lie delivered in the key of absolute sincerity. Christine smiled and finally picked up her tea and took a sip that was less about thirst and more about buying 2 seconds to decide something. How much longer do you think you'll be here? That depends on Mr. Voss. Of course. Another smile, this one with something sharper at the edges. It always does, doesn't it? Elena said, "It was nice meeting you," and stood, and Christine stood too with the reflex of good breeding, and they faced each other for 1 second over the small table, and in that second Elena understood 3 things simultaneously: that Christine had not yet been told about the footage, that she was actively trying to determine how much Elena knew, and that the moment Elena walked out of this room, Christine would make a call. She walked out of the room and back to where Holt was standing in the corridor with a phone in his hand and an expression that told her he'd heard every word through the earpiece. She said quietly, "She's going to call someone in the next 2 minutes. Trace it." Holt was already dialing. She kept walking until she found the room where Damian was waiting, and she closed the door behind her and she said, "She doesn't know about the footage. She's fishing. She came here to assess the damage and buy time while Marconi repositions." She looked at him. "She's going to move tonight. Whatever the contingency is, she'll trigger it in the next few hours before you can consolidate what you know." Damian looked at her for 1 second, and in that second, the thing that had been almost visible behind his eyes in every previous moment broke the surface fully. Not emotion in any soft sense, but the specific, raw recognition of a man who had spent his entire adult life in a world where trust was the rarest and most dangerous commodity, confronting the fact that the person he'd trusted least 24 hours ago had just handed him the intelligence he needed to survive the next 12. His phone rang. He answered it, listened for 4 seconds, looked up. "Carver just left the East Wing," he said. "He's heading to the basement." "The server room," Elena said. "He's going for a second attempt." Damian's voice was completely flat. "Which means Christine just told him the window is closing." He looked at her, and what was in his face now was not the cold authority she'd first encountered or the late-night exhaustion she'd seen at 3 in the morning, but something older and more fundamental. The expression of a man who has just confirmed the worst thing he suspected was true and is now required to act on it. She made the call. "In under 90 seconds, Elena said. "Yes." He moved toward the door and she said, "Damian." And he stopped, and she said, "What happens to her?" And the question was not tactical, it was personal, and she knew it, and she asked it anyway. He stood in the doorway with his hand on the frame, and he looked back at her, and he said, in a voice that had nothing performative left in it, stripped down to something she'd only heard once before, in the 3 in the morning corridor outside her room. "I don't know yet, and that is the honest answer." He left. And downstairs, the house that had been holding its breath for 2 days began to exhale all at once, and the sound that came with it was not relief, but the particular, irreversible percussion of a situation that has moved past the point where any answer leaves everyone intact. And Elena stood alone in the room and felt, for the first time since she'd crouched down in a frozen alley on West Erie, the full gravity of how far she was from the woman who had almost kept walking. The basement corridor had no windows. This was the first thing Elena registered when Holt brought her down 20 minutes after Damian disappeared through the doorway. Not because windows mattered tactically, but because the absence of them meant no light from outside, no reference point for time or weather, or the city that continued existing beyond the walls of this house. And without those reference points, the basement had the quality of a place where cause and effect operated on different rules than they did upstairs. Holt put her in a monitoring room, 4 screens, a radio set, a folding chair that someone had thought to put a cushion on at some point in the past, and then forgotten about. The cushion now flattened to the thickness of cardboard. He said, "Stay here," and then said nothing else and left, which she was beginning to recognize as his primary mode of communication. The essential instruction delivered and the context omitted because context was someone else's department. She watched the screens. 3 of them showed corridors and exterior angles, the grounds, the gate, the East Wing hallway where, on the middle screen, she could see 2 of Damian's men positioned outside the server room door with the specific posture of people who had been told to hold a position and not ask questions about it. The 4th screen showed the parking structure feed, the same camera that had captured her in the alley, now showing an empty level 2, gray concrete under fluorescent light, nothing moving. She watched the East Wing hallway screen and she waited, and she was aware of her own heartbeat in a way she wasn't usually aware of it, the way you become aware of a sound only when the surrounding noise drops below a certain threshold, and suddenly there it is, the thing that was always there, thumping its patient insistence against the inside of your ribs. Carver appeared on the middle screen at 11:04 p.m. He came from the left, moving with the unhurried confidence of a man walking a route he owned, and he stopped outside the server room door and looked at the two men and said something she couldn't hear. And one of the men shook his head, and Carver said something else, and the quality of his body language changed in a way she could read even through a security camera at low resolution. The slight forward lean, the shoulders squaring, the particular shift that happens when a person stops negotiating and starts asserting. The man shook his head again. Carver reached into his jacket. Elena was out of the folding chair before she knew she'd decided to move. She found Holt in the corridor outside the monitoring room and said, "East Wing, server room, now." And Holt looked at her for exactly 1 second and then spoke into his earpiece and moved. And she followed him because the alternative was standing still, and she had lost the capacity for standing still approximately 36 hours ago. What she found when she reached the East Wing corridor was not what she'd expected, and she'd stopped expecting things to be what she expected them to be, which meant the recalibration was faster now, the gap between perception and adjustment compressing with each new development. Carver had not drawn a weapon. He was standing in the corridor with his back to the server room door and his hands visible and his face carrying an expression she'd never seen on him before. Not the measuring suspicion he'd shown her in the office, not the flat professional authority she'd observed from a distance, but something rawer and more complicated, something that looked like a man who had been running a calculation for months and had just arrived at an answer he hadn't wanted. Damian was 6 feet in front of him. The two men who'd been at the door were gone. Moved back, she realized, positioned at the corridor's ends, which created a space between Damian and Carver that was precise and deliberate, a geography of confrontation stripped of witnesses. "Tell me why," Damian said. His voice was completely quiet. Not controlled quiet, the kind of quiet that exists on the other side of control, when a person has moved past the mechanisms they use to manage themselves into something more fundamental. Carver said, "You already know why." "I want to hear it from you." A pause. Carver looked at the ceiling briefly. Not an evasion, Elena thought, watching from the corridor's edge, but the specific gesture of a person who is deciding whether to tell the truth when the truth will cost them something significant and the lie has already stopped being viable. "Because you're turning this into something your father would not have recognized." "My father is dead." "I know. My father left this to me." Damian's voice stayed quiet. "He left me a criminal organization that was bleeding. He left me men who were scared in a war on 3 fronts and a name that meant something to the wrong people for the wrong reasons." A pause. "I've spent 3 years making it into something that doesn't have to bleed, and you've spent 2 months trying to burn it down." Carver looked at him directly. "That's not what I've been doing." "The server room, Carver." "Yes." No hesitation, no pretense. The confession delivered with the resigned directness of a man who has decided that dignity is the only thing still available to him. "Yes." "The server room. And the surveillance data I passed before that, and the financial routing I gave to Christine 6 weeks ago." He looked at Damian, and his jaw was set in a way that was not defiance but was close to it. The last posture of a man who has done something he believes was right and is prepared to be destroyed for it. "Because the life you're building is a lie, Damian. The legitimate businesses, the clean money, the future your father promised. Victor promised that for 20 years, and he died in the river because the people who make those promises always die in the river. You can't buy your way out of this world. You can only control it or be consumed by it. So you chose to hand me to the people trying to consume me. I chose to take control back before someone else did it worse." The silence that followed was the kind that happens after a truth that can't be put back in the container it came from. Elena realized she was holding her breath and let it out slowly through her teeth. Damian looked at Carver for a long time. Then he said, "You drove me to school after my father's funeral." "Yes." "You told me Victor's name meant something, that I shouldn't let them forget it." "I meant it. And this is how you honor it." Not a question. Carver said nothing. And the nothing was the most complete answer he could have given because it contained everything: the contradiction, the grief, The specific moral failure of a person who had started from loyalty and arrived, through a series of decisions each of which felt justified in the moment, at betrayal. Damian said, "Where's Christine?" The question changed the room's temperature. Carver's expression shifted. Something moved across it, quick and then gone, and Elena caught it before it disappeared. Not guilt, not fear, but surprise. The specific surprise of a person who has just realized they didn't know something they thought they knew. "She told me she was going to talk to you," Carver said slowly. "She said she was going to negotiate." "Negotiate what?" She said she had terms, that Marconi was prepared to offer terms for a peaceful transition if you would—" "Carver," Damian's voice cut through. "Where is she right now?" And Carver looked at him, and the surprise on his face had deepened into something that looked like the beginning of a different understanding. The moment a person realizes that the story they've been operating inside was not the story they thought it was, that the woman who told him she was on his side and Victor's side and the organization's side had been operating on a different set of instructions entirely. "I don't know," he said. "She said she was—" The lights went out. Not a flicker. Not a gradual dimming. The corridor went to absolute black in an instant, and with the darkness came a sound from somewhere above them. Not an explosion, not yet, but the precursor to one. A deep concussive thud that traveled through the walls and the floor and into the soles of Elena's feet and up through her bones. Then the backup generators kicked on, and the lights came back at 40%, and everything was the color of old photographs. And somewhere in the house, an alarm was sounding, and Marcus's voice came through Holt's earpiece loud enough for Elena to hear the individual words. "East perimeter, 6 contacts. Armed, they're inside the wall." Holt grabbed Elena's arm. "Move." The next 4 minutes were the most compressed of her life. Holt moved fast, faster than she'd have credited him. A big man covering ground with the efficiency of someone whose body remembered things his age was trying to forget. And Elena moved with him because his hand on her arm was the only navigational information she had in a house that had become, in 40 seconds, an entirely different place than the one she'd been learning to move through. She heard the first gunshots from somewhere to the north. Exterior, the grounds. A rapid exchange that lasted 8 seconds and then stopped, which she understood was not the end of anything but the beginning. Holt said, into his earpiece, "Where's Damian?" A response she couldn't hear. His face tightened. "East stairwell, now." He changed direction. She went with him. The east stairwell was concrete and emergency lighting, and they went up rather than down, which was counterintuitive, and she almost said so until she understood. The basement had 1 exit. The upper floors had 3. In a situation where the perimeter had been breached and the attackers' positions were unknown, you moved to options, not to walls. 3rd floor landing. Holt stopped, listened, pushed through the door. The hallway was empty and the emergency lighting made it look like the set of a film about the end of something, all shadow and amber and the particular visual grammar of wrongness. She heard Damian before she saw him. His voice, from the room at the corridor's end. "How many?" Marcus, from inside the same room. "We have 6 confirmed on the east grounds. North gate's been breached. Rourke has 4 men there. South approach is—" A burst of static. "South approach. We've lost contact." "When did we lose it?" 2 minutes ago. That's not a technical failure. No. Elena pushed through the door into what turned out to be a large room that might have been a study at some point and was currently functioning as a command center. Marcus at a laptop. 2 other men she'd seen around the house with weapons drawn and positioned at the room's 2 windows, and Damian standing at the center of it with a phone in one hand and the particular quality of stillness he had that was not calmness but its functional equivalent. The focused compression of a person running multiple analyses simultaneously and keeping none of them on his face. He looked at her when she came in. The look lasted 1 second and contained several things she didn't have time to decode. "Rourke," he said into the phone. "Northgate holds. I don't care what it costs. Northgate holds." He ended the call and looked at Marcus. "Christine." "We haven't located her." She triggered this. "She's been in contact with the strike team since she got here. She knows the layout, the defensive positions, the generator locations." He moved to the window and looked out at the grounds where, in the distance, Elena could see the moving lights that meant men running in the dark. "She's their GPS. Find her." "If she's already out, she's not out." Damian turned from the window. She came here for something specific, something she needs to be present for. He looked at the room, and Elena watched him work through it. The flicker of calculation behind his eyes, the slight tension at the corner of his mouth that meant he'd arrived at something he didn't like. The ring. Everyone went still. She knows what the key unlocks, he said. She helped design the security protocol. She knows the ring alone isn't enough. You need the ring and a secondary authentication at the secure location. She cannot complete the transfer to Marconi without being present when both are used. He touched the ring on his hand. She needs me in that bunker. She needs me to open it. She's going to try to take you, Marcus said flatly. She's going to try to use Elena to take me, Damian said, and the room went a different kind of still. Elena heard this. She processed it. She said, she's going to use me as leverage. She knows about your mother. Damian's voice was even, which cost him something she could see in his throat, the slight movement there. She knows about the dialysis schedule because Marconi built that profile. She knows that the fastest way to move me is through you. He looked at her with an expression that had nothing tactical left in it. I should have moved you out of this house 12 hours ago. I wouldn't have gone. I know. The window on the right exploded inward. Not a bullet. A concussive charge, a small one, designed to blow glass rather than walls, and the two men at the windows went down from the percussion, and Elena hit the floor on instinct, and Holt was already moving, pulling her toward the interior wall, and Marcus had his weapon up and was moving toward the blown window before the glass had finished falling. From outside, very close, a voice. Damian Voss. A woman's voice. Not shouted, projected with the deliberate clarity of a person who has done this specific calculation and arrived at maximum efficiency. Christine's voice. I have 4 men inside the north wing. I have 2 more at the medical center where your mother is being treated, Miss Mercer. A pause, timed precisely. I want Damian in the east courtyard in 3 minutes with the ring. That's all. 3 minutes and this stops. Holt had Elena against the interior wall with his body between her and the blown window. She could feel the cold pouring in through the gap. The winter night, the outside world, the temperature that had been 11 degrees the night she found the ring and had not improved since. She looked at Damian. He was standing in the center of the room with glass on his shoulders from the blown window, and he was not looking at the window or at Holt or at Marcus. He was looking at her. And in his face was the thing she'd been watching build since the first morning in the library. The thing that had been arriving in pieces through every conversation and every 3 a.m. admission and every moment of involuntary honesty, fully assembled now and undeniable and visible in a way he wasn't trying to prevent. The specific vulnerability of a man who has found, without looking for it and at the worst possible moment, something he is not willing to lose. Don't, Elena said. He looked at her. Don't go out there for me. Your men are at the medical center. Rourke told you it was covered. She held his eyes. If you walk into that courtyard, she doesn't let you walk back out. She needs the ring, and she needs you to open the vault, and once she has both of those things, you become a liability. She said it clearly, without softening it. You know this. Yes, he said. So don't. He said, 2 of her men are unaccounted for inside this building. I know. Which means this conversation is a distraction. She's positioning while she talks. He looked at Marcus. The courtyard is a kill zone. She wants me in the open. He looked back at Elena. She's going to come inside. 3 seconds of silence in which the distant sound of gunfire from the north grounds provided a rhythm nobody was choosing. Then Holt said from the wall, movement, west corridor, 2 contacts. And the door at the far end of the room came open, and 2 men Elena had never seen came through it, moving fast and low. And Marcus went toward them, and the room became something she could not fully track. Compressed violence, fast and ugly, nothing like the films she'd half-registered over the years, but closer to a collision, bodies and sound, and the particular grunt of men doing damage to each other in a space too small for it. She stayed against the wall. Holt stayed between her and the room. 30 seconds. Maybe 40. It felt like a duration that didn't map onto any unit of time she understood. Marcus went down. Not out, but down, his knee giving under him, his weapon hand pressed to his side. One of the 2 men was on the floor, not moving. The second was still standing and had oriented toward Damian, and Damian moved toward him with a speed and economy that shocked her, because nothing in his bearing until now had suggested it. He closed the distance in 2 steps, and what followed was brief and final and left the second man on the floor next to the first. Damian had blood on his hand. His hand, not someone else's. A cut across the palm from the glass or the altercation, she couldn't tell, and he looked at it with the expression of a person taking inventory rather than reacting. Marcus said from the floor, "I'm okay," with the cadence of someone who was mostly okay. "Ribs," Holt said, looking at him. 2, maybe. "I'm okay." From outside, 30 seconds, Damian." He looked at Elena. She looked at his hand. "Let me—" "Not now." "Damian, I need you to listen to me." He crossed the room to her, and he was close. Closer than he'd been in any previous moment. Close enough that she could see the glass dust on his jacket, and the thin line of red crossing his palm, and the thing in his eyes that he was no longer making any effort to contain. "There is a passage from this room, behind the panel in the east wall. It goes under the courtyard and comes out in the structure at the property's edge." He said it quickly, precisely, each word chosen. "Holt takes you through it. You go now, you go fast, and you don't stop." "And you?" "I'm going to end this. Alone. I have men on the grounds. You have men who are pinned on the north gate and an unknown number of contacts inside the building." She looked at him. "That's not a plan. That's a direction." "Elena, I'm not going through the passage without you." "Yes, you are." "I'm not," she said, and she said it the way she'd said everything since she walked through his gate, clearly and without performance, just the flat fact of it, and it landed the same way all those previous statements had landed. It reached him. "I'm not leaving this house without you. That's not negotiable." Outside, Christine's voice cut through the window. "Time." The explosion that followed was not the east courtyard. It was below them, the lower level, the basement, a detonation that traveled up through the floor and shook the room and brought dust from the ceiling in a fine gray fall that settled on all of them like something final. The house groaned around them, a structural sound, deep and reluctant and undeniable. Marcus said, from the floor, "The vault." Damian's head came up. "She's blowing the passage to the vault," Marcus said. "She doesn't need you to open it. She got the secondary authentication from the server room. She's been planning to blow it from the start." He looked at Damian with an expression that was half pain and half the urgent clarity that sometimes accompanies pain. "The ring was never the point. The ring was to keep you focused on the ring," Elena said very quietly, "like the ambush kept you focused on recovering it. The same play. Executed twice by the same mind. First at the tactical level, the ambush to distract from the server breach, and now at the strategic level, the confrontation in the courtyard to distract from the vault." Christine Voss had not improvised any of this. She had built it, layer by layer, over months, and what she had built was a trap with multiple chambers, each one designed to open into the next, and they were in the final chamber now, and the walls were moving. Damian's jaw went tight in the way she'd learned meant the calculation had finished and the decision had been made. He looked at her. She looked at him. He said, "I know a faster way to the vault than she does." "Show me," Elena said. He took her hand, the injured one, she realized, and felt the warm stickiness of the cut against her palm, and didn't flinch. And he moved toward the east wall panel, and Holt came off the wall and Marcus got up from the floor with a sound that suggested his ribs had a different opinion about this plan than the rest of him did. And the house shook again from somewhere below as Christine Voss burned through 3 years of Damian's future, one detonation at a time. And Damian pushed open the panel in the east wall, and the dark beyond it was absolute, and he went into it first without hesitating because this was his house, and his family's blood had built it. And some part of him, Elena thought, following him into the dark with his injured hand wrapped around hers, had been waiting his entire adult life for exactly this moment. The moment where everything he'd been protecting was threatened at once, and he finally understood what he was actually fighting for. From somewhere in the darkness ahead of them, a sound. Footsteps, fast, moving away from them toward the vault. Christine, or her people, already in the passage, already closer than they should be. And Damian tightened his grip on Elena's hand and moved faster, and the dark pressed in on all sides. And behind them the house continued its terrible settling, and the distance between who they'd been 3 days ago and who they were in this moment was exactly the length of a frozen alley on West Erie and a ring that caught the light from a parking structure lamp, And it was, Elena thought, running in the dark with a man she hadn't known existed 72 hours ago, the strangest and most irreversible journey she had ever taken without choosing to take it. Ahead of them, the passage curved. Ahead of them, the vault waited. And ahead of them, Christine Voss stood in the dark with everything she'd built toward for 2 years, and the one variable she had never managed to account for. The woman who had returned the ring instead of keeping it, who had walked through the gate instead of walking away, who had chosen, at every decision point in the last 3 days, the option that made no rational sense and yet had led, with the peculiar logic of things that are actually true, directly here, into the dark, moving fast, holding on. The passage smelled like cold concrete and old water, and the particular mineral stillness of a space that had been built to outlast everything above it. Damian moved without a flashlight because he didn't need one. He'd walked this passage in the dark as a child, his father's hand on his shoulder, Victor Voss showing his 9-year-old son the bones of the house the way a man shows a boy what will one day be his responsibility. Every turn was in his body rather than his memory. Left at the junction where the ceiling drops. Right at the iron door that no longer locks. Straight through the narrow section where the wall's close to shoulder width and you have to turn slightly sideways to pass without scraping. Elena moved behind him with her hand still in his and did not ask questions, which he registered somewhere beneath the operational layer of his thinking as the specific quality of trust that is not blind but chosen. She couldn't see where they were going, and she was going anyway, not because she had no other option, but because she had decided he was worth following into the dark, and the distinction mattered to him in a way he didn't have time to examine. Behind them, Holt and Marcus. Marcus breathing through his teeth with the careful rhythm of a man managing pain as a budget he can't exceed. Ahead of them, footsteps. Getting closer, which meant the passage curved in a way that was bringing them toward each other rather than in the same direction, and Damian processed this and slowed and pressed himself to the wall and pulled Elena in against him with one arm and put his mouth close to her ear and said, "Stop," in a breath so quiet it barely disturbed the air. She stopped. He felt her heartbeat against his arm. Fast, not panicked, the rhythm of someone who is frightened and functioning, which was exactly right. The footsteps ahead slowed too. Someone on the other side of the curve had heard them. 3 seconds of absolute stillness in the dark. And in those 3 seconds, Damian's mind mapped the remaining distance to the vault chamber, the probable number of contacts ahead, Christine's likely position relative to the detonation point, and the singular fact that the passage was narrow enough that the first person around the curve had an insurmountable disadvantage regardless of armament. He released Elena's hand. She found his arm in the dark and gripped it once. Not to stop him, he understood, but to communicate something that didn't have a word in the situation they were in, and then she let go. He went around the curve fast and low. The man on the other side was not expecting fast and low. I was expecting a cautious approach, the posture of a person moving carefully in the dark, and what he got instead was Damian Voss moving the way he moved when the performance of control had been stripped away by necessity, and the encounter was brutal and brief, and left the man against the wall of the passage with his weapon no longer in his possession and his ability to communicate with Christine temporarily suspended. Damian straightened. His shoulder hurt. He'd caught the wall on the way in, the same shoulder that had been carrying the accumulated tension of 72 hours. And the impact had woken it up in a way that was going to be a problem later, which meant he needed to finish this before later arrived. He picked up the weapon. He moved forward. The vault chamber was 20 feet below the east courtyard, accessible through the passage and through a second entrance from the main basement that Christine's people had blown. He could see the rubble from the detonation blocking the main entrance as he came through the passage into the chamber's edge. And he understood immediately what she'd done. She'd collapsed the primary access to create a choke point, forcing anyone coming to the vault to come through the passage, where she'd positioned the man he'd just gone through. She hadn't anticipated that he knew the passage better than she did. The chamber was lit by battery lanterns that her people had brought, 4 of them, positioned at the corners, casting the space in the amber emergency quality that the rest of the house had taken on above them. The vault itself was set into the north wall. Reinforced steel, the Voss crest engraved at eye level, a biometric reader to the right, and a secondary input panel to the left, where the encryption key from the ring would be entered. Christine was at the panel. She had a device connected to the input terminal. A bypass unit, he recognized the model, high-end,
the kind of equipment that cost more than most people made in a year, and her fingers were moving across it with the focused efficiency of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Two men flanked her. A third stood near the passage entrance, which was where Damian had emerged. And this man turned when Damian came through and raised his weapon, and Damian shot him in the shoulder of his weapon arm because he needed the room quiet rather than clear, and a shoulder shot accomplished that without the complications of a fatality in a confined space.
The sound in the chamber was enormous, and then it was gone, replaced by ringing and the specific stunned silence of people recalibrating. Christine did not move from the panel. The two men flanking her turned and oriented on Damian, and from behind him came Holt, moving with the methodical authority of a man who had been doing this for 30 years and had long ago made peace with the arithmetic of it. And the two men were managed in the next 20 seconds with the grim efficiency that Holt brought to every physical problem he was presented with. And then the chamber was quiet, and it was just Damian and Christine and the amber light of the battery lanterns and the vault between them. She turned from the panel slowly. She looked at him, and she looked at the weapon in his hand, and she looked at his face, and she said, with a composure that was genuine rather than performed. He'd been watching her perform composure for 2 days, and this was different. This was the real thing, the bedrock of her. You're faster than I planned for. You planned for me to be in the courtyard. Yes. With Elena. Yes. She said it without apology, which was its own form of honesty. I needed you in the open. I needed you distracted. The woman was useful for that. She tilted her head. I underestimated what she was useful for in other directions. Did the bypass work? A pause. Partially. I have the routing architecture. I don't have the transfer authorization. The biometric component requires you. She looked at the vault, which is why we're having this conversation instead of me simply leaving. You need me alive. For approximately 4 more minutes, yes. He looked at his aunt, the woman who had held him when he cried at his father's funeral, who had been the only adult in his life in the months after Victor's death, who had treated his grief as grief rather than as a problem to be managed, who had taught him to play cards at the kitchen table in the house on Lakeshore because she said a man who couldn't read a bluff would never survive the city, who had then spent the better part of 2 years building the architecture of his destruction. And he felt something he hadn't expected to feel, which was not rage and not grief, but the particular cold clarity of a man who has finally stopped being surprised. He said, Why? You know why. I want to hear it from you. He was aware that he'd said these words already tonight, to Carver, in the corridor outside the server room, and that he was saying them again, and that the repetition said something about him. That he was still, despite everything, a person who needed to understand before he could act. Christine looked at him for a long moment. Behind him he could hear Holt's measured breathing and the distant percussion of whatever was still happening on the grounds above them, muffled by 50 feet of earth and concrete. Your father built something real, she said, something that mattered. It had weight, it had teeth, it demanded respect in a city that respects nothing it can't touch. She looked at the vault. And you've been spending 3 years diluting it, dissolving it into restaurants and property portfolios and legitimate enterprises that will never protect you the way the real thing protects you. Because legitimacy is a fiction, and the people who want to destroy you don't care about your tax returns. She looked back at him. Victor would not have recognized what you're building. You've said that. Through Carver, yes, because I knew you wouldn't hear it from me. Why not? Because you've never trusted me the way you trusted the men your father left behind. I was always peripheral. The aunt who came to holidays. The woman who got a settlement and disappeared. Something moved across her face. Not regret, he thought, but its structural cousin, the acknowledgement of a fact without the willingness to wish it different. I loved your father. I did not love what this organization became under you, so I made a decision. You made a deal with the people who killed him. The silence that followed was the longest one yet. Victor made enemies, Christine said finally, and her voice had changed, lower, something in it that was nearly private. Victor made enemies, and one of them had him killed, and I spent 6 years trying to find out which one, and I found out, and it was not Marconi. She looked at him with an expression he had never seen on her face and could not name precisely. It was Carver. The word detonated in the chamber more completely than the explosion above them had. Damian's hand did not move. His face did not move. but something behind his eyes did. Something that had been a fixed point in his understanding of his own life shifted on its axis, and the shift was enormous. And he felt it the way you feel a structural thing give way, not in the place where it happens, but in everything connected to it. Carver ordered my father's death, he said, each word placed carefully, like a person testing ice. Carver had Victor killed because Victor was going to move the organization in exactly the direction you've been moving it, legitimate, clean. Carver knew it would cost him everything he was. So he arranged it, and he made it look like the Marchetti family, and he held your hand at the funeral, and he told you Victor's name meant something. Christine's voice was even, which made it worse. I found out 8 months ago. I have the proof. Documented, sourced, a chain of communication that will hold up under any scrutiny. She paused. That is what I gave Marconi, not your financial architecture, though I gave them that too. Victor's murder. The truth of it. Because Marconi has the reach to use it in ways I don't, and the only thing I wanted was for Carver to face it. The chamber breathed around them. Damian said, and my operation, the 3 years, the people depending on the structure I've built. Collateral, she said, and the word was terrible in its flatness. I'm sorry for that. I am. But Victor mattered more. Victor is dead. Yes. Her voice, for the first time, broke slightly. Not dramatically, not a performance, just the hairline fracture of a woman who has been holding something for 6 years and is very tired. He is. The passage behind Damian shifted. Elena came through it, Holt beside her, and she stopped when she saw the room and read it in the way she read everything. Quickly, completely, the gaps filled in by the quality of what was present rather than what was said. She looked at Christine. She looked at Damian's face. She did not speak. Damian lowered the weapon. Christine watched him do it. The proof, he said. Where is it? Secured externally. My attorney has instructions. If I don't make contact within 24 hours, it goes to the federal authorities, the Tribune, and 3 other outlets I won't name. She looked at him. It goes regardless of what happens to me in this room. I wasn't going to, but I know, she said, and she did know. He could see it. She had known him since he was 9 years old, and she knew that he was not, regardless of what his world required of him, the kind of person who resolves problems by eliminating the people who create them when those people are sitting in front of him with empty hands. That's the only thing I regret about all of this, knowing that about you and doing it anyway. From above them, silence had fallen. Gradually, over the past few minutes, the sounds of the assault on the grounds had diminished to nothing, and Damian registered this now, the cessation of it, and understood that Rourke had held the north gate and the perimeter had been re-established, and whatever Marconi had sent tonight had been insufficient to finish what Christine had started. He said, "The men you brought into this house." 3 are yours now, Holt said from behind him, meaning contained. The 4th? A pause. The 4th didn't make it. That was before we got to the passage. Damian nodded. He looked at Christine for a long moment. Then he said, "Give me your phone." She took it from her coat and held it out, and he took it and looked at the recent communications. There it was. The outgoing call made 47 minutes ago, 12 seconds in duration, a number he didn't recognize that he would have his people trace within the hour, and which would connect, he already knew, to the Marconi coordination line that had directed tonight's operation. "You called them off," he said. It wasn't in the call log, but it was in the timing. The assault had stopped 12 minutes after this call, which meant she'd signaled them at some point that the operation had failed, that continuing to expend resources was no longer strategically sound. "I called them off," she said. "Why?" She looked at Elena. Elena, who was standing at the edge of the chamber in her museum coat with concrete dust on her shoulders and her hair, and who looked, in the amber lantern light, like a woman who had been through something and had not been reduced by it. Christine studied her for a moment with the specific attention of a woman who has spent her life assessing people and has arrived, in this moment, at an assessment that surprised her. "Because I watched you go into that passage," Christine said, "and I watched her go in after you, and I understood something I hadn't understood before." She looked back at Damian. "Victor went into every dark place alone. It's what killed him, ultimately. Not Carver, not the enemies he made, but the fundamental isolation of a man who believed that love and power were mutually exclusive." She was quiet for a moment. "You have something he didn't. I didn't want to be the reason you lost it. The chamber held this. Elena said nothing. She was looking at her hands. Damian said, "You're going to tell me everything about Carver, every piece of documentation, every communication, the full chain. Yes. And then you're going to leave Chicago. I understand. Not for 6 years this time." He looked at her, and what was in his face was not forgiveness. It was something more complicated and more durable than forgiveness, which is the acknowledgement that a person can be fully known, and the knowing doesn't resolve into anything clean. For good. Christine nodded once. "Carver," Holt said from behind them. Damian turned. "Go on." They found Carver in the East Wing corridor, exactly where Damian had left him, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall and his hands on his knees, and the expression of a man who had heard the assault begin and had not moved toward it and not moved away from it, and had simply sat with the knowledge of what he'd set in motion and waited for it to resolve one way or the other. He looked up when Damian came down the corridor. He looked at Damian's face and at the weapon no longer in his hand, and at Elena behind him, and he looked at Holt and Marcus, and then he looked back at Damian and said nothing. Damian stopped 6 feet in front of him, the same distance as before, the same geometry, different information between them now. "Victor," Damian said. Carver closed his eyes. "Look at me," Damian said. Carver opened his eyes. "Victor," Damian said again, and this time it was not a reference to an event or an accusation or the opening of a question. It was his father's name, said the way you say the name of something you have just lost all over again. The second loss that comes when you discover that the first one was not what you thought it was. Carver said, he was going to destroy it. Everything Victor built, everything we all gave. Don't. Carver stopped. "Don't explain it to me," Damian said. "I don't want the explanation. I've had enough explanations tonight." He looked at the man who had driven him to school the morning after his father's funeral, who had sat beside the hospital bed when Damian took a bullet at 23, who had been in every room where every important decision had been made for 13 years. And he felt the loss of it complete itself. The loss of the father, the loss of the man he'd thought had mourned the father, the loss of the story he'd been telling himself about what his life was built on. He said, "Was any of it real?" Carver was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "All of it was real. That's the part you won't understand. I loved Victor. I love you. And I still did what I did because I believed it was right, and I have been living with that for 13 years, and I will live with it until they put me in the ground." His voice did not shake, but it was close. "There is no version of a man where every true thing about him is consistent. I know you know that." Damian looked at him. He did know that. It was the most honest thing Carver had ever said to him, which was its own kind of devastation. "Holt," Damian said. Holt moved forward. Carver did not resist. The aftermath took 3 days. This was the part that no one who had not lived through something like it understood. The violence, when it finally resolves, takes an hour. The aftermath takes weeks and sometimes years, and the weight of it is distributed unevenly across the people who survive it in ways that don't always map onto who did what or who deserved what. The Marconi coordination line traced back to a mid-level operation out of the south suburbs that had been running on Christine's intelligence for 14 months. The federal authorities received the Carver documentation through Christine's attorney on day 2, and the investigation that followed was the kind that doesn't close quickly. Methodical, thorough, the federal variety that moves like cold water, finding every gap. Carver was taken into federal custody on day 3. He did not speak to Damian again. Christine left Chicago on day 1. She took a car to O'Hare, and she did not look back, which Damian knew because he'd watched the camera feed and she'd gone through the terminal with the straight-backed efficiency of a woman executing a decision she'd made completely. No hesitation, no last glance. He turned the feed off when she went through security. He did not watch the plane leave. The Marconi family, deprived of their intelligence source and their coordination structure, and 2 of their operational captains who had been present at the estate that night and were now in a different kind of custody, went quiet in the way that organizations go quiet when they've overextended and been burned. Not destroyed, not immediately, but diminished to the point where aggression was no longer the rational choice. Chicago's criminal landscape, which had been holding its breath for 6 months, exhaled into something approaching equilibrium. None of this was clean. None of it resolved into the kind of conclusion that has satisfying edges. Two of Damian's men had been seriously injured in the grounds assault. One of the Marconi contacts had not survived the chamber beneath the vault. The north gate had held, as Damian had ordered, and Rourke had held it with 4 men against 9, and the cost of that was real, and had faces and families, and would be accounted for in ways that money could partially address and couldn't otherwise. Elena's mother had her Thursday dialysis appointment without incident. Rourke's men had been there, visible enough to deter and professional enough not to alarm the medical staff. And Elena's mother had noticed them and had asked the nurse if there was some kind of security event she should know about. And the nurse had said no, and her mother had said she supposed she'd imagined it, and had then called Elena on the drive home and said, "You sound better," with the accuracy that Elena had stopped being surprised by. "I am better," Elena said, which was not entirely true and not entirely false, which made it the most honest thing available. On the 4th day, Damian came to find her. She was in the library, the real library, the one where she'd first been left alone with a book she couldn't concentrate on. And she had a cup of coffee that was actually hot this time, and was sitting in the chair by the window reading a book she was actually reading, which felt like a form of recovery. The grounds outside were white and undisturbed. The wall was intact. The gate was closed. Whatever violence had passed through this place had left the exterior of it unchanged, which she was finding faintly strange. She kept expecting the evidence to be visible somehow, the air to look different. Damian sat in the chair across from her without announcing himself, which by this point she was used to. She put the book down. He looked like he'd slept, which was an improvement on every previous version of him she'd seen. His hand had been properly cleaned and bandaged, and the bandage was white and neat against his skin. He was wearing a different suit, dark gray, not charcoal, the distinction apparently meaning something to him. And his collar was buttoned, which meant he'd reestablished some form of the armor she'd watched come apart over the past 72 hours. He set something on the side table between their chairs. She looked at it. A check. She didn't look at the amount immediately. "Medical debt," he said. "Your mother's outstanding balance, the collection matter. 3 years of treatment costs projected forward to give you a cushion while we determine what a longer-term arrangement looks like." Elena looked at the check. "The ring," he said. "You returned something that you could have kept. In my world, that has a value that isn't abstract." "In my world too," she said. She looked at the amount on the check. She looked at it for a long time. The number was large enough that she had to sit with it for a moment. Not to process what it meant financially, she could do that immediately, but to process what it meant to have a number that large sitting between her and the thing that had been consuming her for 14 months. She said, "This is too much. It's proportionate." "To what?" He was quiet for a moment. "To what you actually did," he said, which was not only return the ring. She looked at him. He was looking at the window, at the white grounds, with the particular quality of attention he brought to things he was working out rather than things he'd resolved. "The analysis," he said. "The server room. Christine. Carver. You walked into this house as a stranger, and in 72 hours you saw more clearly than people who've been inside it for years." He looked back at her. "I want to understand how you do that." "I read things," she said. "I've told you that." "You read people," he said. "That's different. The things you were trained to read don't argue back. Sometimes the provenance of an object tells you more than the object itself. You look at what's around it, what's missing, what's out of place, what the context is trying to tell you, and what it's trying to hide." She shrugged slightly. "People aren't that different. Most people find people very different. Most people are trying to read the surface. I look at the context." He was quiet again. The library had the particular quality of quiet that well-built rooms have in winter. The outside cold pressing against the glass and the inside warmth holding its own. And between them a membrane of stillness that felt both fragile and substantial. He said, "I'm going to continue what I've been building, the legitimate structure, the transition." He said it in a way that indicated he was not asking for her opinion, but was also not asking for it. "Good," she said. "It's going to take longer now. The Carver situation, the investigation, the restructuring." He turned the ring on his finger. The habitual gesture, she'd cataloged it by now. The thing he did when he was integrating information rather than acting on it. "But the direction doesn't change." "Good." she said again. He looked at her. You're not going to tell me it's complicated. It is complicated. You know it's complicated. You don't need me to tell you. Most people feel the need to say it anyway. I'm not most people. No, he said, and something in how he said it, not with surprise, but with the particular tone of a confirmation that has been accruing evidence for days and has finally reached the threshold of certainty, made her look at him more directly. He reached into his jacket pocket and set something else on the side table, next to the check. The ring. She looked at it. You're wearing the ring. That one's different,
he said. She looked more closely. It was a ring, platinum, the same weight and quality as the signet, but smaller, no crest, no engraving on the outer face. She picked it up. On the inside of the band, in the same deliberate scratchwork as the encryption key, 2 words, nullus timer, no fear. She looked at him. My father had 2 rings made, Damian said. The signet, which was always the symbol of the organization, the key, the legacy, the thing that announced what the name meant. He looked at the ring in her hand. And a second one, which he wore on his right hand, which wasn't a symbol of anything, which was just his, the private thing, the thing that had nothing to do with empire or legacy or what the name meant to the city. He was quiet for a moment. He took it off the night before he died. I've kept it since. Elena held the ring and felt the weight of it and the cold of platinum taking on her warmth, and understood, with the precision she brought to things that mattered, exactly what was being offered and exactly how much it had cost him to offer it. She said, Damian, you don't have to. I know. I'm not asking you to stay because of what you did, he said, or because of the debt or the protection or any transactional reason. I'm asking because. He stopped. He was not, she had learned, a man who stopped in the middle of sentences, and the stop meant the sentence was going somewhere he hadn't pre-mapped. Because the house is different with you in it, and I've been in this house for 13 years and I didn't know it could be different. She looked at the ring. She thought about the woman who had almost kept walking in a frozen alley. She thought about $42 in checking and her mother's dialysis and the form letter with the name spelled wrong. She thought about what it had cost her to walk through that gate and what it had turned out to be worth, and how those 2 things were not the same calculation. She said, I'm going to need to go back to work. Of course. The museum, my actual job. I have a backlog of Civil War correspondence that isn't going to authenticate itself. I know. And my mother's appointments. I need to be there for those. I know. And I'm not going to be decorative. She looked at him directly. I'm not going to sit in this house and look like a possession. If I'm here as a person who does things and has opinions and will tell you when you're wrong. You've been doing that since you arrived, he said, and the almost smile appeared, fuller this time, and it changed his face the same way it had the first time she'd seen it, in a way that was difficult to dismiss, and that she had stopped trying to dismiss sometime around 4 in the morning 2 days ago. Then we understand each other, she said. She set the ring back on the table between them. He looked at it. She picked it up again and turned it once in her fingers and set it on the table on his side, closer to him than to her, but not returned to his pocket, not refused. An object in a negotiated position. An object that meant not yet and not no, and not without knowing what I'm choosing, but also, I'm still in this room, I'm still at this table, I have not walked out the door. He looked at where she'd placed it. He looked at her. She picked up her coffee and drank it, and looked out at the white grounds where nothing was moving except the occasional shift of wind through the bare trees at the property's edge. And she felt, not happiness exactly, which seemed too simple a word for what the last 4 days had rearranged in her, but something that happiness was a part of, something that included the medical debt being resolved, and her mother's future being less catastrophically uncertain, and the knowledge that she had walked into the most frightening situation of her life, and had not been less than herself inside it. Some compound thing for which she did not yet have the exact word but was willing to sit with until it named itself. Damian reached over and picked up the ring and turned it once in his own fingers, the mirror of what she'd done. And then he set it back down in the same position she had, between them, equidistant, in the space where things go when they are not yet decided but are no longer in question. Outside, Chicago pressed against the glass in its February patience, the city that ran on power and history, and the specific kind of survival that requires knowing the difference between what you can hold on to
and what holds you back. And the lake beyond the estate was frozen to the horizon, and somewhere in that cold and vast expanse, the ice held all the things the city had lost and covered them in white, so they could be walked over without anyone having to look at them directly. Damian Voss sat in the library of his father's house and watched Elena Mercer read, and for the first time in 13 years, the room did not feel like a command center or a fortress or a place where strategy was developed and losses were absorbed. It felt like the thing that rooms become when more than one person agrees to be ordinary inside them. She turned a page. He turned the ring in his hand once more, the old habit, the reminder of what he was fighting for. And then, quietly, he stopped turning it, set his hand flat on the arm of the chair, and left the ring still. Because the habit had always been about the thing he was afraid of losing, and the thing he was afraid of losing was no longer the weight of platinum on his finger. It was sitting across from him in the pale winter light, reading a book, drinking coffee that was finally hot. And it had chosen, without obligation and without transaction and without anyone forcing its hand, to still be in this room. That was the whole of it. That was everything.